Welcome to today's edition of the Sandbox, and thank you for your patience as we sorted out all the tech. Thank you for joining us today. This is a new time zone for us, and we're really excited to have you here and looking forward to hearing your thoughts as well as your reflections on what our presenters will be sharing today. My name is Suzanne Sumuhereza. I am part of the UNDP Strategic Innovation Unit. And today's session will be supported by my colleague Parima, who's in Istanbul, and Zazie, who's in Copenhagen. And we're joined by some excellent panelists from all over the world, who I will let introduce themselves. Since this is our first session in this time zone, we are very lucky to have had the support and thoughtful engagement of my co-host Kira, who I will hand over to shortly to frame the discussion for us. But just a little background and admin. Yes, we shall be sharing the recording, and we usually put together a blog after the session to share some highlights and resources that the speakers and you will bring to the room with us. A little bit about the Sandbox is really a space to nurture and learn from new ways of doing monitoring, evaluation, and learning that are coherent with the complex nature of the challenges facing the world today. We convene a series of participatory sessions as part of the MEL Sandbox, and in each session, we collectively explore a theme in depth, inviting practitioners to speak about their experiences, testing new ways of doing MEL that help all of us to navigate complexity. You are welcome to share any resources that you think are relevant to this discussion in the chat. Any questions as well, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, where you're from, what you do, what brings you here today, and please put any comments that you have in the Q&A, any questions that you have in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that the speakers get to as many as we can in the time that we have. To start off, we're going to do a quick poll just to get a sense of who's in the room. I hope it works. If it doesn't, we'll use the chat function to see who's here. But if you could please take a couple of seconds to fill that out and share the information with us so we know who's here with us today. I will do mine. Oh, can't do mine. And with that, I would like to hand over to Kira, who is the Senior Program Manager at the Centre for Public Impact based in Melbourne, Australia. Kira has been invaluable in pulling this event together, thinking through how we may approach this topic thoughtfully and with a true appreciation for complexity. Kira, please take it away.
I'm wanting to see how many curious cats you've got in the room. Really by this poll, it's fantastic categories, great. Yeah, so what a joy to be here. Thank you so much, UNDP, for inviting me to co-host this. It's a real honor, and I'm really excited to see what comes out and the conversations that we have together. We wanted to start by saying that monitoring and evaluation and learning in complex adaptive systems look different. So we know that evidence looks different, analysis looks different. And that means that we're not able to use our standard processes and methods to give us results that are deemed credible and reliable. And this difference offers us an opportunity to examine traditional evaluation business as usual and consider who was it that deemed those processes and practices credible. And why should others' definitions not be used? So this is the question of dominance and about ways of knowing, and essentially it's about power. And when we talk about questions of dominance and power, this leads us very quickly to colonization and ideas of decolonization. What might it mean in the context of our evaluation practice? So we're super lucky today to have these speakers, these four speakers who have been doing just that. And that, oh, I'm sorry. Oh no, I've lost the thing I wanted to say. It's disappeared. So just to hand over to our first speaker, who is Irena. I had a beautiful biography of Irena that I was going to read, and for some reason my browser has crashed, and with it the beautiful biography. Irena, could you please be so gracious as to introduce yourself and the work you're doing with Oxfam GB? I would be so grateful.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, very much in Australia. I'm married to somebody from that part of the world, so I know the time differences very well. So, Kiri, is this the start of my 10 minutes, or are you just doing a round of introductions? Sorry, it wasn't.
This was the start of your 10 minutes, but
Okay,
actually
perfect.
I found my introduction. Would you like me to read the little blurb, or do you want to just launch straight in?
It's fine. So, no, my name's Irene Gout. I'm the head of evidence and strategic learning in Oxfam, Great Britain for the past few years, and we've been on a pretty crazy journey that's very, very messy and complicated and inspiring and tough, actually, because it asks us all to think from within our heart space as well as our head space, and then make it happen in action. So I'm going to, let me just share my screen. So Oxfam is it's just moving. Yeah, there we go. Oxfam is a pretty huge universe to occupy. We work, we're present in 86 countries, 6 regions. There's 23 affiliates that are kind of part of the governance system, 8,500 people in the employee base, let's say, tens and tens of thousands of volunteers. Our work our footprint reaches around 20 million people. Our budget's around almost €1 billion, I think. And we have partnerships with 4,200 other organizations. And the work that I'm representing is just one part of a very complex and complicated, in both senses of the word, set of collaborations. It's very much a state of where we are at this particular moment, after starting this journey in 2020, when we had a new strategy in Oxfam, Great Britain, but also globally. And in it was the very explicit intention for the very first time in our history at decolonizing our work. We had no idea what that meant. We had no idea where that was showing up. And we knew that as the work unfolded, it became very clear that I, for example, as a white person, needed to really look myself in the mirror and really be very, reflective on what I was bringing forth through the choices I was making and the ways I was behaving, as much as in the choice of methods. We often go to methods when we think of M&E, and this is a little bit of our story. What I will show is a number of slides that were also for us ways in which we could help think about this thing. So they're almost like little tools for thought, these diagrams that I'll share with you that might work for you as well. Oops. So the first one is really what was driving our shift. And they are two sides of this. These circles have really been our anchor for the past 4 years. And it was about figuring out what different kinds of questions we needed to ask ourselves in order for us to center learning and the shifting of power. And shifting power, decolonizing knowledge, anti-racism are part of a related complex dynamics that we were trying to tackle. I won't go into all of them, but it was very much the the overlapping space that I want to talk with. So the question for you is, of course, what are your drivers that are shaping any shifts you might be embarking on? A second piece was of us, again, these are two kind of like tools that we developed for ourselves. It wasn't just a matter of, oh, systems change. It was like, oh my gosh, there's so many systems to change, and they're all like nested systems. And so on the left-hand side, this was very much, this represents the priority areas of change for Oxfam Great Britain. We started to realize that it was these nests of changes that we had to figure out, and that it looked different where you were. You can see in the bottom left-hand side, there's a decolonial partnerships in a big part of our strategy. And the change is very close to our heart, literally. So it's OGB that needed changing, Oxfam as a confederation, the international aid sector, but not national systems and global systems. That was more the focus of our thematic areas, which you can see, like, for example, in climate justice. This makes a big difference in both the system side of the equation, but also the decolonial side of the equation. And it just helped us to figure out, it is really complex, and we need to be very non-formulaic in how we approach that. So on the right-hand side, many of you will recognize this. This is the systems change thought tool from the water of systems change that we use to say, well, what part of this puzzle is asking for change, and what is our contribution to that? Then decoloniality was an area of work that we needed to, an area of thinking and being above all, that we needed to figure out. This is a framing that was developed very much from our colleagues who had lived experiences of racism and coloniality. And it was essentially about respect, solidarity, and accountability. And so these three elements we're taking into our thinking about, well, how does this show up, these boxes? How do these boxes show up in our systems approach to M&E? Where are we still commanding and controlling? Where are processes still too complex and not considering locality enough? And the middle one, of course, being central to it all is how are our minds showing up in different versions of superiority still. So this diagram, I'm sure many of you will also have used. It brought us back to really identifying what's within our sphere of control and being very hard about it. It required a lot of discussions with our board, actually, because they were not interested in not controlling measurement. But we said, we do campaigning in the UK. We can tackle that. We are in charge of various pots of money. We can tackle what stays here, what goes out, what's measured. We have relationships with country colleagues, and we can work on our side of the equation and measure that. Risk management became huge. Where is risk decentralized and dumped in a way when you're not thoughtful about who and the how of the decisions around measurement? So the sphere of control, sphere of influence, sphere of concern is one area that we keep coming back to when we say, well, is this really our remit? Oops. The way it shows up in practice, and these are just a couple of examples, is we have got an active process of seeking feedback from countries more than partners, because the country colleagues are the ones who hold more of the relationships with partners than we do. And it's feedback to us about how we're showing up. It's often extremely hard-hitting. We do that through interviews, stories, surveys, and we have a mechanism within OGB to see how are we changing what we do in order to reduce the frequency and the presence of those negative feedback that we're receiving about the control that we're still holding on to. We have got sense-making and reflection sessions that are based on how people experience change. So we work to a very limited extent with indicators that I'll come back to. We make possible learning events, but they're very much owned by others. They're not, we have funding that we kind of co-negotiate with people and with different areas of work, and then it's up to them to do it. We provide support as needed, but it's very much about making sure that the systems learning angle is part still of what we offer and contribute, but not through holding the design. The aspirational indicators are really interesting for me because they are an extremely limited set of about, 6 or 7 indicators that are they're like stretch goals. They are asking us, how much are we holding on to onto money? When cost recovery money comes in from grants that we have, how much are we passing on? It's about how much authorship from the Global South is present in our publishing. The global publishing team is part of my remit, and we're trying to track how much authorship and how much our time goes to our colleagues in countries versus our global colleagues who want to do advocacy with the World Bank, for example, or big institutions, but that's not necessarily the platform. They might have other platforms than our publishing platform to lean on. Impact evaluations have changed hugely. They are now set up as learning partnerships. They are no longer our randomized controlled trial type impact evaluations. We have decentralized the governance of that as well, with Southern colleagues being in the steering groups. And they kind of emanate from curiosity that is experienced in countries or regions, which can include Scotland and England, which we also consider countries and regions because that's where we're also operational. And they say, well, we really need to understand this if we're going to take it forward. And so we then have a global committee that says, okay, well, let's go for these, because rather than those, we have more requests than we can fund. And then the learning is very much about what the partners and Oxfam in country need. And sometimes there will be an impact evaluation that reaches the board, whereas before our impact evaluations were purely created for the board. So we've had a real change in that area of practice. And then we have other kinds of on-demand and annual syntheses. And this is one where we're trying to figure out who is OGB not listening to enough yet. For example, our country colleagues would produce lots of evaluations and lots of material and lots of insights about the challenges of their contexts and how they're trying to change systems, but we never listened. And so we are using annual processes now to synthesize what comes out of countries and making that available to anybody, so that particularly the board, so they understand the challenges, but also myself, so that I can appreciate what the working contexts are and what our contribution into that might look like. There are, could I get a time check, Sue, or whoever's, Kira, sorry. 2 minutes, perfect. So this is an interesting thing that's popped up recently, is a version of triple loop learning. There's lots of versions of that out there. And we are asking ourselves different questions as we evolve. And so our frontiers of what needs to change are also shifting. So we started by really saying, you know, are we doing the right things? We're examining our doing. And so it was all about coherence and consistency of our decolonized systems change practice. But now we're thinking much more about, well, is this even right? Like, what is useful for whom? Should we even be doing impact evaluations like this? Should we be doing these routine syntheses? And I think the thing that's really challenging now is, who are we in this system? And we're looking at the being part of it. So it's about letting go, obviously, of the steering wheel in many ways, but in some ways, even getting out of the car. And that's a really tricky one, because it means making myself redundant, making others redundant, letting go of certain functionality. And that's the big frontier that we're facing at the moment. This is the final big visual that we're working with now. And it's just forcing us to ask a whole bunch of questions. And I'll focus on 3 of them. First, what does the end state of this thing look like? I have no idea. I don't know what fully decolonized systems change practice looks like. We don't know. And it's even, yes. And what is the theory of change of getting there? Professor Sabelu Ndlovu has, who works a lot on knowledge justice, he talks about, how revolutionary or how reformist do you want to be? And that's caused a lot of questions, forced us to ask a lot of questions about what does our institution allow and what do we want and how do the two connect? We've been looking at decolonizing solidarity frameworks on the left-hand side. You can see a number of qualities that we want to see. Are they present? We've worked a lot on safeguarding, but we haven't worked a lot on reparations. How does our M&E practice around systems change? How does reparations show up? What is that even in that practice? And at the bottom, are really all our artifacts are the bits of the M&E process that need to be interrogated through these questions and particularly decision-making, I would say. That's really where we're not struggling, where we're challenging ourselves and struggling. So it's an issue about building this ship while, not just building this ship while sailing it, but you're actually dismantling the basic design assumptions en route. And that is really, it gets my head into a bit of a mess, because you have to have something that you design around, and yet you have to challenge that assumption while you're working with it. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene. That's really excellent. I loved the slides on moving from drivers and principles to practice, because as we're preparing for this session, there really is something to be said about this dual shift to decolonizing while being systems aware, but the actual day-to-day practice and things that we do as practitioners and teams is really interesting. I also loved how you kept track of what's happening as you moved through this process in terms of the questions that you need to ask, the kind of methods that you need to use, who's in the room, who are we not listening to. That's an interesting note for me to sit with, and probably a good segue to Eshban's presentation. So I'll quickly introduce Eshban Kwesiga, whose early career was formed in Southern civil society doing social justice work. He now works with the Global Fund for Community Foundations, which is an organization building the field of community philanthropy. Eshban is specifically involved in curating knowledge and evidence of emergent and alternative practices rooted in communities as active funders and co-investors of their own struggles. So Eshban is going to talk to us a little bit about these alternative measurement approaches, who has power, and measuring what matters. Eshban, you are welcome.
Thank you, Sue. Again, my name is Eshban. I'm with the Global Fund for Community Foundations. First, what do we do? I have a friend, a colleague of mine recently described us as a really small grant-making organization with few resources, but we make up for it in a really long name, the Global Fund for Community Foundations. And our work has really been to build the field of community philanthropy, and our politics on reimagining new ways and new approaches to monitoring and evaluation is really very much informed by what we've been seeing and feeling in the world of community philanthropy. Community philanthropy is the simple idea that communities, wherever they are in the world, that they come to the development process with their own resources, and that they contribute those resources to the development process. And that sometimes, this is cash, sometimes it's in-kind contributions, sometimes it's social capital, intellectual capital, relationships that already exist in the community, and that all these things come together into a sparkling cocktail that then makes the development process, and that money in itself is never enough for development work to happen. Why does community philanthropy exist? Because the international aid system, it has its rules, one of which is that one must speak English, you must speak jargon, you must know the difference between MEL and MEL, you must maintain relationships with funders, especially funders in the global north. And there's many communities around the world that are not able to play by these rules. And because they're not able to play by these rules, they still have to respond to their development needs with the resources, with whatever resources that they have. And that's really the field that we've been working in the last couple of years. And if we acknowledge the premise that communities are indeed co-investors, co-contributors, and co-funders with their local resources to the development process, then we also ought to acknowledge that they should have a say in how success is defined and in how monitoring and evaluation is done for the work that they do. And for a long time, a lot of monitoring and evaluation, like Irene just said, has really very much been determined or decided by power and who has the power to do that. And it's mostly traditionally been funders. So we come to this work with the premise that communities are co-investors in this work, and that they also have a right to determine how monitoring and evaluation is done and how success is defined. But to do that, we have to use our moral imagination to collectively develop new approaches. About 4 years ago, the Global Fund for Community Foundation convened close to 130 civil society organizations to start to think about how do we shift power in evaluation back to where it belongs? How do we shift power in evaluation back to communities? And one of the things we learned that, one of the things that came out of that was that there's a bit of a huge disconnect between what happens in communities and what funders seek to measure. The other thing we learned is that many organizations and many communities maintain some kind of secret spreadsheet, which is really their own internal organic definition of success. And that secret spreadsheet doesn't always show up in the reports that they send to funders or in the reports that appear in the international development narratives around how this work is done. So in the last couple of years, our work has really been to work with community foundations around the world to start to reimagine and develop new approaches to how monitoring and evaluation is done. And it's very much been a very it's been a very emergent process, that has led us to different paths and to different routes. And we also like to think that in many ways we are building the ship as we sail it, or filling the stepping stones as we cross the river. And one of the critiques I think of this work that I've had is that sometimes when we talk about reimagining monitoring and evaluation, people seek to hear about a tool to replace all other tools. And this is not what this work is about. It's very much about our ask to the international aid system has been to negotiate the coexistence of how communities define success and some of the other traditional approaches that have existed. So I want to segue a bit to talk about some of the more practical examples that we've seen around the world. And I think that two or three come to mind. One is with a community foundation in Indonesia. I'll just paste the link here. Where are you? You disappeared. Yeah. One is with an organization that we work with in Indonesia that has really dismantled the expression pamakna, which means to make meaning. And its roots came out of the fact that a lot of what was happening in Indonesia was really centered around the complexity of civil society, and that traditional monitoring and evaluation approaches were not able to properly capture that. So what they did is that they went around the community and found local historians, journalists, to start to frame a story of what change in civil society space. And the people that do this, I think that traditionally would have called them monitoring and evaluation consultants, but the people that do this or that have done this have been members within the community, journalists, historians, who have been referred to as pamakna. What we've seen in Palestine is that, again, I'm going to post a story here. Where are you? All the links seem to be disappearing at the time I need them. Okay, I think I'll find that later. So what's been happening in Palestine is that one of the organizations that we worked with talked about the value of measuring community well-being, and that sometimes the international system is a bit, it leans very much into the more quantitative stuff, number of books delivered, etc. And issues around community well-being, such as trust, dignity, safety, that we've tended to shy away from those. And what we're seeing in Palestine is that there's a growing conversation on what exactly does community well-being look like, and that's something that ought to be measured, and that's something that ought to be negotiated and brought to the forefront of how we reimagine monitoring and evaluation. I will end here to say that the work of reimagining monitoring and evaluation systems, like I said, it's very much an emergent process, and our invitation to the international aid system has been to make an investment in those emergent processes and emergent ideas, and to not be so obsessed with trying to think through the whole thing all the way to the end, but to allow we as a sector to cross the river as we feel the stepping stones. That's it.
Thanks so much, Eshman. I love those really evocative images that you have, like crossing the stepping. It's like an invitation to cross the river together, isn't it? To define the stepping stones together in a collaborative process. I also love the secret spreadsheet idea, that communities have a secret spreadsheet. I think often we have this I hear from funders this idea that if only we could get people to use the data, and it's like, no, if only you were using data that was meaningful to communities and was speaking to the problems that they think are pertinent and meaningful and important when these issues that they're trying to work to shift. I think it's such a great demonstration of an assumption from the funder's side that people aren't interested in the data when actually they 100% are. Oh, we've got a load of questions, but I think we're going to save them till the end. Some great questions coming through. But without further ado, I'm going to bring on Samantha, if that's okay. Eshban, thank you so much for your presentation. I loved it. Now let's hear from Samantha. So Samantha Tuckney is an evaluator with 30 years experience working with rural and remote First Nations health and wellbeing organisations in Northern and Central Australia. Currently, Sam is facilitating multi-year developmental evaluations of several First Nation-led innovations and is undertaking doctoral research exploring developmental evaluation use in First Nation contexts. Sam's work in Indigenous cultures to decolonize practice necessarily brings in a system lens because of the way that Indigenous ways of knowing highlight the interdependencies of everything that exists. Welcome, Sam. Enjoy your 10 minutes.
Thanks, Kira. Thank you so much. And thanks for the opportunity to contribute to the this webinar today. My work is very much grounded in work on the ground here in Australia. So I guess this my contribution to today's presentation will take a different slant to some of the other presenters, which hopefully adds the diversity of thinking around this complex space. So I'm a fifth generation, settler Australian of Swiss, Italian heritage on both my mother and father's sides. And I live and work here in Mabantua in Alice Springs and on the unceded lands of the Aranda people in Central Australia. And I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging for their ongoing care for country and all of the stories and wisdom that it holds. And I would also like to acknowledge the Pitjantjatjara, Yankunytjatjara, Ngunnawal people and the Warlpiri, Amadjara, Gukadjaru and Walmatjari peoples in Central Australia, who I also have the privilege to work and learn with. I've worked in evaluation and applied social research with and for First Nations Australians for more than 30 years. And for more than a decade, I've utilised developmental evaluation approach to support the development of various First Nations-led social innovations. And as a distinct approach to evaluation, developmental evaluation decenters the evaluator as an expert and positions the evaluator as part of the team to facilitate collaborative learning, to inform decision-making in innovation development in complex settings. And so developmental evaluation is guided by principles. It centers relationships and its practice and its principles include systems thinking and complexity perspectives. This means it pays attention to multiple perspectives into relationships, power dynamics, context, boundaries, and emergence. Central to my practice as a developmental evaluation practitioner are my long-term relationships with my First Nations colleagues and my ability to listen deeply to them to better understand their life worlds, their ways of being and learning, and what they value and aspire to in the innovation work that they're leading. Importantly, I have an ongoing reflective praxis to inform my evaluation practice in these culturally diverse contexts. And I consciously try to bring a decolonized approach to my evaluation practice. In each project, my enactment of evaluation and learning processes is necessarily different because it's guided by the relationships context and what reciprocity means in each situation. So to illustrate what some of this practice looks like, I wanted to highlight, with permission from my colleagues, a couple of projects that I've been working on. The first is a developmental evaluation of a co-designed corporate and financial governance capacity development program called the Good Governance Program, with 2 First Nations corporations in Central Australia, the Kura Aboriginal Corporation and the Granites Mine Affected Area Aboriginal Corporation. The program is self-funded by 2 corporations and is now in its 6th year. At the beginning of the project, I worked with the First Nations directors, who refer to themselves as Yapa, to identify their aspirations for the Good Governance Program and what an effective good governance program would look like from their perspective. This centered the directors' aspirations and voices in the theory of change and in the evaluation and learning inquiry framework that was developed. And these have been reviewed and updated at key intervals over the 6 years. In practice, we've embedded an effective learning system that is fully integrated with the Good Governance Program. I pay attention to developing relationships with the directors and the other team members who are integral to the program, and I participate in all the workshops to learn alongside the directors and support the co-design process. I facilitate an evaluation session with the directors to capture their reflections on the workshops, what they're learning, and their suggestions for changes to strengthen the workshops going forward. And as part of including multiple perspectives, I do post-workshop interviews with the trainers, program coordinator, and investment advisors who are part of the program to also capture their experiences and ideas. Directors review their feedback and assess its uptake at the subsequent workshops as part of a strong internal accountability process that centers the director's voice and supports rigor in the co-design process. I pay attention also to the broader context and systems in which the directors are operating and incorporate the reflection on these in the learning system, as these can't be separated from the development and effectiveness of the program. So this embedded evaluation process has supported the transformation of the program's design and delivery to ensure it aligns with Yapa ways of teaching and learning. And the process centers the directors as the knowers in this context and privileges two-way learning that has strengthened relationships between the directors and the other team members. Directors are effectively learning and applying their increased knowledge and capacity to make more informed decisions to govern their corporations. And they've also reported that the program, in their experience, is an exemplar of two-way working and learning at the cultural interface. Another example of decolonized evaluation practice with a systems thinking lens is from a few years ago when I was engaged as an evaluation facilitator to work with a group of Anangal women who are Ngangkari or traditional healers and who work through the Nanadara Pitjantjatjara Yankunytjatjara Women's Council Ngangkari program. What emerged was a process in which these traditional healers created a collaborative painting as part of the evaluation of their work. So during a week-long workshop, the women conceptualized the painting and determined who would paint different sections to articulate their healing work, the source of its power, its integrity and knowledge base, and their relational position within its interconnected tradition, and how it operates all at once in different temporal dimensions that Western society calls past, present, and future. As they painted, they sang Inma, songs associated with healing and Ngangkari powers, calling up and imbuing the painting with these energies and knowledge handed down to them by their ancestors. This painting, which is 3 meters long, now hangs in the NPY Women Council's conference room, and its constant presence asserts Anangal ways of being, knowing, and healing, and supports the women to share their work and knowledge from their worldview. A film was also created to share the story of this painting in its full complexity and interconnectedness and knowledge base, and the basis for the effectiveness from which the healers' worldviews determine. The women spoke in their first languages in the film, and it contains English subtitles, and you can access that film via the Women's Council's YouTube channel, which is linked at the bottom of this slide. This complexity of meaning could not have been conveyed in a written evaluation report. This decolonized evaluation approach enabled the evaluation to reflect collective cultural values and belief systems, and amplified the women's understanding of how the world is and their place in it. This is how the women define traditional healing's effectiveness and values within their life world, and asserted that it could not be evaluated using imposed criteria from another worldview. And it was based on relationships of trust that required me to reflect on my positioning and respect for different life worlds and knowledge systems. The feedback from the women at the end of the project was that the experience of the evaluation process was life-affirming and healing in its own right, which speaks to its potential to create cultural safety as a process. So in terms of what this practice requires from me as a practitioner, mostly it requires a whole body and mind experience, as it's always a dynamic, co-evolving and adaptive practice. Deep listening and collaborative sense-making at the cultural interface is always essential. Creativity, use of storytelling and metaphor as valid methods. Responsibility for interpreting learnings for the mainstream stakeholders to meet First Nations ways of evaluating. My ongoing reflexivity, and ensuring that evaluation practice is meaningful and life-affirming for First Nations people rather than extractive. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Sam. This is such a gorgeous picture. Your presentation has left me reflecting on how conscious we have to be as we show up in the work. Not just mixing methods so we can get multiple perspectives, but really thinking about what kind of positioning we take in relation to the communities that we're working with. I'm feeling like it's feeling heavy, like it's a big burden on an individual. And this is something that this feeling is recalling conversations that we had in our past sandbox, where we think about the individual practitioner sitting within a team, sitting within an organization that has a very specific culture and way of working and engaging, and what a weight it is to be moving differently or making this transition, dual transition in that kind of space. So you've given me something to think about. And maybe Nish has some additional thoughts, because they will be sharing some case studies with us. And I'll briefly introduce Nish, who is an independent community builder, researcher, facilitator, and dreamer who focuses on building cultures of care. They have over 15 years of experience in grassroots organizing and campaigning in the UK in areas as diverse as disability justice, digital rights, and environmental justice. Nish strongly believes that collective transformation is necessary to bring change, and that can only be achieved through practices of care, equity, and compassion. Take it away, Nish.
Thank you so much, Sue. Hello, everyone. It's really lovely to be here, and also to all the other speakers, because I feel like what I'm about to present definitely echoes what a lot of other folks have said. So really grateful to be here. Sorry if I sound a bit muted. I've just had a very bad cold, but yeah. So my work centered in the UK, working with people from the global majority who live there and around the projects that they've been working on. I'll be introducing 2 case studies, but before I start, I wanted to talk a little about what I'm trying to focus on, which is, in my experience, whenever I talk to anyone from the global majority about evaluation projects or programs, the immediate reaction is sort of this like shrinking, this closing off, because so often these processes are extractive. And most of the time, people feel like they're only doing evaluation to meet the requirements of the grant maker. Eshban actually spoke about sort of the secret spreadsheet. And I love that idea, but I've often found that organizations, especially small ones, don't have the capacity to even develop those sorts of secret spreadsheets, because the funding for that kind of work is so limited, and also there's just like there's very little capacity and time to meet all the deliverables that a funder has asked, and also kind of do your own processes of learning. And there's also generally the reason why a lot of them are, when there is that work done and it's kept secret, is because there's a general fear of like funders actually stealing that information and misrepresenting that knowledge in a way to meet their own particular political goals or aims. And the work that I want to reflect on, and the work I've been trying to do with a lot of different people, has been to shift that into evaluation processes and data collection that can actually be a healing process, which can actually create spaces of growth, and actually allow people to explore what that might look like, and even think about MEL, especially on the like learning side of things, to actually ensure that people have the way move in a direction that actually meets their needs and their goals and isn't always just an extractive process. So specifically, I'll be talking about embodiment as a space of transformation and change through evaluation. Karina, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So one of the most recent pieces of work I've done is I've been an accountability partner for a review that was done by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust on their Sustainable Future program, which was their sort of environmental side of that work. So just to give a little bit of context to what was happening, the Joseph Rowntree Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, after the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, sort of did a little bit of research and found out that a lot of their funds had come through the slave trade and through colonial wealth. So they wrote a whole acknowledgement piece and said they were going to be reflecting on that. At that time, the two core reporters on this report and review, Anu and Laura, decided to submit quite a radical proposal of doing an evaluation process for their entire Sustainable Future grant-making part. And what their radical kind of process was to step outside of what was traditionally funded by the funder and bring in people they called non-grantees, which tended to be people from marginalized backgrounds. And that also tended to be people from the global majority. These people, everyone was resourced and given support to develop, to share what they needed to share, and also given an opportunity to talk about what was missing. So the report itself was published with hugely transformative suggestions based in a more grounded and larger understanding of the sort of climate and environmental justice movement. Specifically said that this kind of idea of siloing environmental justice was part of the problem. The review itself and that report was then moved into an implementation period, and the report from that is just coming out. But generally it had a few different practices, like having gathering spaces without having predetermined outputs and outcomes, and trying to create space for people to actually connect and grow together. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So what we found from that whole process was that from the funder, there was a genuine interest in the findings from an intellectual and abstract perspective. So there was a really, like, people really liked the idea of it. They liked the idea of the report, but when it came to actually building the transformation and building the tools to transform the program to meet the actual results, that's where the tension kind of came up. And so what I've been thinking a lot about is like, why does that come up and where does that come up? There's an amazing writer, thinker called Kai Cheng Tom, who does a lot on abolitionist work, but also transformational work. And they recently posted this window of transformation to kind of explore where this change happens and how do we create spaces for people to actually change. And what happened, I think this image really beautifully reflects what I saw happening, which was, one, there was like a performative response to the sort of Black Lives Matter movement, which was kind of the institution itself was going, okay, we need to do something because people are asking us questions. And then once the report came out, there was sort of an immediate response in the sort of fragile, collapsed kind of area of things, where there was a freezing, a sort of immobilization that came from people holding the shame and the guilt from these sorts of understandings and reflections, even though the review itself isn't shaped by that at all. But that kind of response of, oh no, we don't know how to do this, we don't know how to like deal with these complex emotions. And also in the final stage, so after the implementation period, what we found is that the organization has kind of responded in a very negative way, even though their response was positive. And what they started doing was like attacking sort of the findings and going, who did this? Who are they? We want to know who they are, even though the names are all provided. So overall, we've seen that all of the nervous system activation areas, and that's left the sort of space for the window of transformation very difficult to navigate. And that is the space of change. So what we found is when we worked with funders, when we're working with power, the key issue is that people in positions of power respond in different ways when they are being challenged. And it is about that long process of working with that funder and it is long, it's not because of this sort of nervous system activation and because of the difficulties in sort of transforming spaces that comes to like it becomes very difficult to kind of make that change possible. So looking at power is also kind of building these sort of agreements right from the get-go of like creating space for that and creating space for the embodiment of all the different things that happen in these processes and processes of change. And it's about creating that capacity to deal with the emotional and well-being aspects of those sorts of transformational spaces. Within that, there was also an issue because within this sort of disruptive response and the sort of the implementation period has now ended, and a lot of the projects and programs that came out of that sort of ended with them. What's happened is the harm that comes from the original extractive evaluation process and the grant funding process has been reproduced. But also at the same time, the people who were part of this process have learned that there's another way. So there has been some ongoing pushback and transformation, not just by this in the space of this funder, but also in other funders, for people going, actually, this is how we need it, or actually, we actually need to have funding for well-being and core functions, and a sort of empowerment process through that. And also one of the reflections that came out of that implementation period was that participants saw this process because it was so embedded in people's lived experience in connecting to what was beyond the sort of program, that they found it to be a really healing process. So there is power in just doing the work of trying to change and transform. There is power in trying to do evaluation in this way because it does create spaces of change, but there's also a need to kind of really dive into the well-being, both of the participants and the people who are getting the grants, and also the actual funder and the people in positions of power. That is if we really want to make change, because a lot of these processes, in conversations I've had and in podcasts I've listened to, in a lot of the reading that I've done, is that when these things have been successful, it's often been with like one step forward, 3 steps back, and then another step forward and another step back, and then 2 steps forward. So it's an ongoing and long-term process that requires hugely transformative systemic change, which isn't going to happen overnight, especially if we want it to be done with the values that we want it to be part of. Could I have the next slide, please? Yeah. Thank you. So another piece of work I did was with a program called Decolonizing Economics, and it was with their participants. What I ran was a small workshop, and this is just one small workshop, so it's a very much work in progress, to kind of explore what they would think of when they thought about decolonizing evaluation. Now, their initial response is exactly what I said earlier, which was like, oh no, why are we doing this? This is going to be extremely excruciating, painful, and extractive. And we used, so there's a guide which we've produced, which is a 4-step guide to starting this decolonizing evaluation process that was done through a collective inquiry that we ran a year or a couple of years ago now. And that kind of produced this guide. And from that, I developed a different sort of developed a different sort of workshops structure, which actually used rivers as a metaphor, and through that process we kind of explored what people actually wanted to measure and what people actually needed to measure if they wanted to actually see their programs as successful. So decolonizing economics is made up of a number of different grassroots organizations and people doing this sort of grassroots work to kind of build solidarity and circular economic principles within the global majority structure. And out of that came this idea that people actually really, really wanted a way of looking at evaluation from the perspective of different knowledge systems. So within that, there came out ancestral knowledge, emergent knowledge, gossip as knowledge, embodied knowledge, intuitive knowledge, emotional knowledge, and intergenerational knowledge. And within those, there was a key idea of kind of putting an emphasis on creative methods of storytelling. So embodying that kind of knowledge and information and evaluation within embodied practices. And I think that like the example of that beautiful painting by the previous speaker was absolutely amazing, because I think that's exactly what people wanted. But what they found was that funders were not willing or understanding of that process because they had key criteria that didn't match that. So one of the key things that came up, for example, was wanting to measure care. Like, how do you measure how loved you feel in a space, or how much a sense of belonging you feel outside of the current like sort of practices around and criteria for success. So throughout this process, what we found is that what I found doing this work is that embodiment has always been a center of this sort of practice of challenging power. It comes from the lived experience of being in positions and in structures where this sort of disempowerment is common. And so what came out of it over and over again is, as I've experienced, has been this emphasis on lived experience and emphasis on embodiment as a space and for transformation, and embodiment as a space for evaluation to shift into. Yeah, I think that's this final slide is just a few links to what I've just shared. I think they will be sharing the full slides with you all at the end of this. But yeah, get in touch as well. I'd love to have conversations with people as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nish. That was so rich and interesting, and the questions are flowing. We had prepared a couple of kind of wide kind of warm-up questions for everybody to ask each of the panelists to start the answers. But actually, I think there's a bit of a theme coming through the questions that we're seeing about power, really. I think people are interested in how people are managing those power dynamics. I think you spoke about it a lot, Nish, and the different ways of knowing is basically they have different levels of power, don't they, in the kind of traditional dominant mainstream. And a lot of the questions seem to be, how is it that you manage this power between the paradigm where power is held and it's held with the funders, and then a more kind of dispersed structure where power is held by those who have knowledge, or those who hold risk, or those who would have different levels of a kind of autonomy and accountability. I could see that there was Irene was typing an answer in the question, so I don't know if anybody else wants to. When I saw you come off mute, that's always a sign that you have something to share. Does anybody want to answer any of those? Any reflections on how you manage those power dynamics in the context of the decolonization process?
So I can go first. I think that in the community philanthropy world, really, like, power is at the center of a lot of the work that we've done, because the international aid system has usually been a bit dismissive of the idea of local resources and communities as active contributors to their own struggle. And we've seen the argument of local resources as a long-term strategy to flatten the power dynamic, to say that, you know, the international system thinks or feels that because they contribute money, then that gives them the power to determine how monitoring and evaluation is done. So our argument has been that, in fact, you're not the only contributors of money. And that sometimes this argument has been dismissed, but it's something that we've really stuck to as a long-term strategy to flatten the power dynamic. Because I think that there's something to be said about speaking to the international system in a language or with words that they understand, which is really, you know, if I bring more resources, then if I bring resources to the table, then I have the power to determine how monitoring and evaluation is done. And our argument has been that, in fact, you're not the only contributor of resources. In some cases, it has worked, in others, it hasn't. But yeah, that's been our angle.
Great, thank you. I think, Sam, you mentioned it a bit when you talked about like the cultural interface, again, and your role as straddling that.
Yeah, I think it's always you know, present in the context that we're working in, and I think that some of the work that I find helpful is around how Michael Quinn-Patton talks about that power isn't infinite, and so some people talk about having to share power, which means some people have to give up power for others to take up power. And so I guess coming at that from a slightly different lens of saying, actually, if you create a process which where the First Nations people that I work with, they sit in power, their own power, and you invite, you know, non-Indigenous people into that space, then that automatically kind of shifts the dynamic. So some of the work that I do is out on country, and so that automatically shifts the power. So whatever, you know, the non-Indigenous people want to bring into that, it's really challenging for them to assert that dominance in that kind of a context. And I think even in some of the workshop spaces that we create in town here in Mabunjwa, you can create a space where that power that the First Nations people that I work with, my colleagues, can sit in their power because we use interpreters. We don't, you know, a lot of the workshops I do, we only work with interpreters. So First Nations people are speaking in their first languages. And so that completely changes the power dynamics in the space and how people have to listen, how people have to, you know, change the way they're participating in that dialogue. So I think it's complex and it's never easy, but it's always, yeah, it's always like a mindful practice that we have here in terms of how we share, how we create space where power, that First Nations people can sit in their power and hold power in these dialogues.
We live a very strange tension because we automatically hold a lot of power as the largest member, I guess, of the messy ecosystem of Oxfam. And we have had various stages where it's been interpreted and by some colleagues as, oh, you hand over something. But power is, everyone has a version of power, right? And it's in fact very disrespectful way to think that others don't have their versions of power in any relationship. So so it's not about, for us, me, it's not about, it's about change, transforming power rather than shifting power, which has this kind of notion of that you throw something into someone else's lap, right? And we've had some very thoughtful processes around that, and we've had some very not so thoughtful processes around that. So we talk about responsible transition a lot, is like, what does responsible transition look like? And not to assume the ceding of certain versions of power, because we get, at the same time as we get asked to kind of step back, we also get asked to step up. And how do you balance that? Because we have a responsibility in terms of the solidarity, and we're part of having to make the change. So the power is a tough one. We always get it. It's always imperfect how we look at it, but it's also very relational. Well, it's obviously relational, but I'm sometimes a power holder, but sometimes in the decision-making sense of the word, and sometimes not at all. Decisions happen to me that I have to deal with. And so it's always asking, where does whose power reside, and what does it look like, and who wants it to shift in what way, in order for equality, and I think the healing was something that really touched me, that came out in several contributions. That is ultimately what we need to make possible through our reflections and our learning. It often is too cerebral, and so power resides in the head, whereas I think the equalizing happens in another part of your body.
I love that. And I think I also heard again, like from several of you guys, that there's this idea of evaluation as a life-affirming practice, and that the importance of deep listening and mutual respect. And that experience can be a healing experience if you've been kind of on the wrong end of badly wielded power. There was a question about making it explicit, like when you're doing an evaluation like this, do you talk about power?
We talk about aspects of power, but not power as a concept on its own, perhaps, but more about who decides, whose version, whose values, whose priorities. Those are aspects of power.
Just to jump in, I think it also depends on, I don't want to be controversial, but it also depends on who's showing up. You know, a Black African woman, which is what I show up as, kind of engages differently with a group. So you might not need to be as explicit as a colleague that looks different from me. So just wanted to throw that in the mix. Sometimes, yeah, that discussion, some things go unsaid because of how you present.
These are such meaty topics, and I can see lots of people nodding and kind of I can sense some cogs churning. Is there anything that anybody else wants to add, like, before I move on to a different question? Or is there anything else, any other comments that anybody wants to make? I think often in these kind of situations, the best conversations are between panelists who maybe are doing similar work. Is there anything that you want to, is there any conversations, any threads you want to pull from anything another panelist presented? And if not, I'll go to another question.
I think one of the challenges, sorry, I think one of the challenges is that I find that I need to not make assumptions about power as well, and how my First Nations colleagues understand their power, or my power in the process as well. And I think that's an ongoing conversation in our relationships in terms of what their expectations of me are, and how I use my power, how they understand my power, and my, you know, in relation to the work that we do together. So I think it is, it's always a navigation for me in terms of checking my assumptions about power and how it's operating in the spaces that we work at the cultural interface, I guess.
I have a question for the other panelists, if that's okay, which is, I find it, having been an evaluation practitioner for a while before I did my work, I find it in many ways easier to ask these questions within the context of single one-off evaluations or initiatives. I find it incredibly difficult to change the system that I'm in that brings forth the need for this work. And I would like to hear any thoughts you have about changing the institutions rather than doing the one-off practices, which is often the kind of unit of discussion I find amongst evaluation practitioners.
I'll take a stab at it. I think that there's something to be said about the fact that in international aid, there are so many good people that are trying to fix problematic systems on the inside. But that in itself is a process that requires some power and some courage. And sometimes our instinct is to look to the left and to the right to see what our peers, our colleagues, and other organizations are doing. And yet, this work on reimagining alternative forms of measurement is very much systems level work that, it could work quite well in one organization and a person might be able to reform that process within the unit of that organization. But I think that there's also something to be said about that it works best as something that's acknowledged across the wider system of development aid. So I think that all this to say is that because we're constantly looking to the left and to the right and looking to each other and our other colleagues are also looking to us, there's something to be said about all of us, I think, that continuously talking about or writing about or articulating some of our unfinished processes and incomplete processes to reimagine monitoring and evaluation so that we can feed off each other's confidence or each other's collective confidence. And that I think that would make this process or this journey a little bit less lonely if you get the sense that other people in other organizations and other parts of the sector are grappling with the same issues as you are, so that it's not something that's addressed at a very unique, at the unit of the organization, but that awareness that this is something that's being addressed across the system. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah. And because of that, what part of my work has been to consistently reach out to people that are attempting to measure differently and to ask them to write their stories, because I think that serves to building the collective confidence in having other people outside our own organizations to do that.
Thank you, Ish. Nish, go ahead.
And I was just going to say, from a completely opposite sort of perspective, I think the difficulty with trying to change institutions is that it's also larger than the institution itself. So, for example, in the UK, as you probably know, there is the Charity Commission. So it's very hard to navigate those transformations of systems when you've got legal structures and legal obligations which don't always allow for that kind of addressing power head on. I'm pretty sure if you mention white supremacy as part of your mission statement in any context or challenging white supremacy, the Charity Commission is going to be straight on you in the UK. So I think that there is that work to be done within the institution and that slow, reflective transformation. But I don't think it can be done just within one institution. I think it has to be institutions working together to change broader systems and broader legal frameworks and building in that sort of transformation collectively with other people. So I think it's like, it is institutional change, but hand in hand collective work that needs to be done on top of like learning with each other, as Ashwan just mentioned.
Thank you. There's, I'm just looking at the time and we need to wrap up. There's been quite a few questions on how teams can handle these transitions, how organizations can handle these dual transitions, what's the learning that we need to be doing, what kind of questions do we need to be asking ourselves in addition to the practices that we pull together to do this work. So if there's any final thoughts on that specific category of questions, what can people do on Monday morning as we tag it here? Happy to hear from our speakers.
I always just come back to who should be, who is in this conversation and who isn't in this conversation, and can I make that different in a way so that there's that there are different voices, views, practices, and I don't make assumptions about the who. I wanted to point out Kate McKegg's question about white fragility in this conversation, and how we how white supremacy can also be very present in how we tackle decolonizing processes. So it's hard, but who? Just ask who should be, who is, what can I do?
So you're on.
Thank you, Renee. I realized I was unmuted. I was prattling along. So in terms of next steps, we will be sharing a blog with some of the highlights from this discussion, the questions that were raised, as well as the resources that were shared. We'll post that to LinkedIn and also share it with our contact list. Please reach out to us if you have any additional questions or want to share anything on that. Thank you so much to our speakers who got up early doors to be with us this morning, and to all of you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Parima is going to share the results of the poll so we can see how many curious cats we had. There are just 9. Just 9. But lots of MEL practitioners. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.